Good morning, boys and girls of Evans Park and Franklin Avenue, and welcome back to week number 2 of our art online classroom. I'm going to be showing you the introduction lesson for the project today, and then after I've done so, please click on your grade level link and complete the lesson. And if you've done that and you've mastered it, please feel free to check the other links and see what they're doing as well. I'd love to see what you're doing, so if you'd like to send a photo to me, have a parent email me at pricet@pearlriver.org. And also make sure that you're filling out the Google Art form, which is located on the homepage of my website. So our next lesson is going to be about watercolor paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pan the camera down so you can see my work surface, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you need to get started. Let's first talk about the paper. This here is watercolor paper. It comes in two different styles. There's a cold press paper and a hot press paper. Cold press paper has a rougher, more textured surface, and a lot of watercolor artists like that because it gives you some more texture in your painting. Hot press paper is smooth and flat. So those are the two different styles. Now, if you do not have watercolor paper at home, you can certainly just use a thicker piece of paper or pretty much whatever you have laying around. But in order for it to look the best it can be, you do want something that's a little bit thicker. Also, I like to work on a board or a surface. That way, when I'm putting the paint onto the watercolor paper, I can lift the board and tilt it if I want the paint to drag a certain way. So a board is a great idea to use. Also, while it's drying, you can pick it up and you can put it into a safe place. That way it doesn't get damaged. To set up the paper, you have to put tape around the edges. The tape around the edges prevents the paper from rolling up or wrinkling. Now I'm using the blue painter's tape, which some of you might have at home, but if you don't have that, you can use masking tape or clear tape. But a trick I discovered was if you take the tape and you go like this before you put it onto your paper, it takes off some of the stickiness. That way it won't rip your paper later on. To get your paper set up, measure your tape. Oops. And when I put it down, I put half of the tape on the paper and half of the tape on the board. And I just give it a little press. And this is also going to give you a nice clean white border, which looks very professional. Okay, so I'm just making sure that I lined up my edges nicely. Give it a light press. And I'm going to need a palette or a surface to mix my paint on. Here I'm using aluminum foil, but you might have one of those plastic trays at home, or you can use a paper plate. Anything will do. You're going to need a container of water and some paintbrushes. Now these are my watercolor brushes I keep at home, but if you have the classroom brushes like this, these are the ones we use in school, these are great too. Okay, so boys and girls, now I'd like to talk to you about the watercolor paint. Watercolor paint comes in tubes like this. It comes in trays like this. It also comes in these really cool, I can't wait to use these, watercolor pens like that. You might also have the paint that we have in our classroom, which is great too. If you do not have watercolor paint and you have access to another type of paint, like this acrylic paint here, you can use it, just water it down a bit. And it won't do exactly the same thing as watercolor paint, but it'll be enough to get you through the lesson. So if you don't have watercolor paint, you can always, try something else. You can use food coloring if you have to, but you want to be able to have something to paint with. Okay, so now that we talked about our supplies, I want to talk to you about the 3 techniques in watercolor that are going to help you make your watercolor painting look just amazing. So I'm going to pan you down and you're going to look at my surface. And what I would like you to do is try using the 3 techniques I'm going to show you, because later on in your grade level link, you're going to be using these 3 techniques to make your project. All right, so the first technique that we're going to learn about is called wet on wet. Wet on wet is when you have a very wet surface, a very wet brush, and lots of paint. And what wet on wet does, it lets the paint kind of swirl and move all over, and you really do not have a lot of control over where the paint goes. Now, wet on wet is great for making things like skies, like water, oceans, and you'll see what it looks like when I put it on right now. Okay, so boys and girls, I put plenty of water. I did not worry where it went. I have my paint set up here. I'm going to start with a little bit of blue. And do you see what's happening? The water is carrying the paint across the paper for me. I'm going to take a little bit of this red. And I'll take a little bit of the green here just so you can see. The amazing thing about watercolor paint is it stays where you put the water. Okay, so boys and girls, you can see that the water carried the paint across the surface and it blended it beautifully. Now I see there's a big puddle right here. So I can take a paper towel and I can just hold it into the surface here for a second and suck up some of that water. You can see it going right up into that paper towel. If I put too much water and I'm not happy with how that looks. So I'm not wiping. I'm just holding it ever so gently onto the surface. There. Now, okay, so you can see how wet on wet works. Gives you a beautiful result. And now we're going to move on to the second technique. Okay, boys and girls, our second technique is called control brush painting. Now, with control brush painting, you have a dry surface and a wet paintbrush. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you more control over where you put the watercolor paint. All right, so I'm going to take my paintbrush here, and this time I'm going to use a paintbrush that has a nice pointed tip. And I'll use some of the green here. And my paper's dry, and I have a wet paintbrush, and I'm going to do some control brush painting. Now, control brush painting allows you to have more control over where the paint goes. So if I wanted to create lines across my paper and not have the paint run across, work on a dry surface with a wet paintbrush. So boys and girls, you can see I'm going a little crazy here, but with control brush painting, you really have control. So I can put the color where I want it to go, and it will stay. And using a different size brush will give me a different look on the paper. These were made with a much wider brush. These lines right here were created by using a very fine tip. This one was done using my fine tip and making all kinds of swirls. And if I have a really big brush here, I can make nice wide brush marks. And if I use the tip of the brush, I can make a very thin line. Look at that. That goes from very wide to very thin. And it all has to do with how you use your paintbrush. All right, boys and girls, so we learned wet on wet, we learned controlled brush painting, and now we're going to learn dry brush painting. Okay, so to use dry brush painting, you need a dry piece of paper, and you need a dry paintbrush. So I'm going to take my paper towel and I'm just going to wipe off my brush so there's no water in it. Now, dry brush painting looks really good with the different types of watercolor paper, like I mentioned in the beginning. So if I have a piece of cold press paper which has a lot of bumps on it, and I use a dry brush, I'm going to be able to pull out that texture from the paper. Do you see all those little bumps and lumps? And this is great if I'm creating things like grass and I need to have this really nice texture. This is great for things like ocean waves, the white foam that's created. Because boys and girls, there is no white in watercolor paint. So you have to use the white from the paper to create highlights. So using a dry brush allows you to create a totally different look from wet on wet or control brush. All right, so boys and girls, let's do a quick review. We have wet on wet. That's a wet piece of paper, lots of water on your brush, and you let the paint go where it wants to go. Control brush painting, you have a dry piece of paper, you have a wet brush, and you're able to manipulate the paint using the shape of the paintbrush. And finally, we have dry brush. Dry surface, dry paintbrush, and it gives you texture on the paper. So boys and girls, give these 3 techniques a try, and after you've done so, please click on your grade level link and continue the lesson that I have for you there. If you master the lesson, please feel free to check on the other grades and see what they're doing as well.